I said stand down, Sergeant. That is a direct order.
I can't let you die, sir.
Check fire, blue on blue. Do not engage. The commander's voice tore through the comms, distorted by static and the rhythmic thrum of the extraction chopper rotors. Sergeant Maya Lin didn't blink. Through the scope of her Mk-22, the world was a silent, greenish monochrome. Her breath held steady in her chest, a trapped bird waiting for release. At 1,200 meters, the target was a pixelated blur of heat signatures behind a crumbling concrete wall. "Commander, I have visual on the trigger mechanism," Lin whispered, her voice devoid of the panic infecting the net. "If he drops that phone, the bridge blows. You're all dead." "I said stand down, Sergeant. That is a direct order. Intelligence says civilians are in the kill box." The wind was picking up, a cross-draft from the valley floor. 7 miles per hour. Full value. "Sergeant Lin, acknowledge." Maya adjusted her elevation turret. 2 clicks. She wasn't looking at a civilian. She was looking at the end of the line for Alpha Team. "I can't let you die, sir," she breathed, barely audible. She exhaled. The space between heartbeats stretched into eternity. She squeezed the trigger. The rain at Fort Bragg didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime stickier. It coated the tarmac in a sheen of oil and reflected the harsh halogen floodlights of the staging area. Sergeant Maya Lin stood at parade rest, the water dripping from the rim of her boonie hat, tracing cold lines down her neck. Beside her, resting on a drag bag that weighed nearly as much as she did, was her Mk-22 advanced sniper rifle. She didn't shiver. She didn't fidget. She was a statue carved from discipline and patience. 10 yards away, Captain Elias Thorne was shouting over the roar of a C-130 warming its engines. He wasn't shouting at her, not yet, but at the battalion executive officer. "I asked for a replacement for Miller, not a PR stunt, Major." Thorne's voice was gravel, hardened by too many deployments and too much smoke. He gestured aggressively toward Lin. "Echo Team operates in non-permissive environments. We sleep in the dirt. We carry 100-pound rucks. I cannot babysit a female asset who's only here because headquarters wants to tick a diversity box." Lin's expression remained flat. She had heard this speech before. In selection, in sniper school, in the Ranger qualification course. It was the background noise of her career, as constant and ignorable as the drone of the aircraft. "She's qualified, Captain," the Major replied, his tone clipped. "Top of her class at Fort Benning. Highest stalking score in 3 years. She's not an asset. She's your new Sierra 1. Thorne turned, his boots crunching on the wet gravel as he closed the distance to Lin. He was a mountain of a man, wide-shouldered, with eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and hadn't liked the view. He stopped inches from her face, invading her personal space, a dominance tactic. "Sergeant Lin," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Captain," she replied. Her voice was steady, low, lacking the tremor most new transfers developed under his glare. "Do you know why Miller isn't here?" "I was told he took shrapnel in the Kandahar Valley, sir." "Miller took shrapnel because he was slow," Thorne hissed. "And Miller was the best shot I had. You think because you punched some paper targets on a sunny day in Georgia that you can fill his spot? We deploy in 12 hours. If you lag, you die. If you hesitate, my men die." "I don't lag, sir," Lin said. "And I don't miss." Thorne scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. He looked around the staging area, his eyes landing on a discarded steel plate, a piece of vehicular armor plating, leaning against a jersey barrier at the far end of the runway. "Rangefinder!" Thorne barked at his comms NCO, Sergeant Vegas Moretti. Vegas handed over the device. Thorne lays the target. 850 meters. Crosswind is gusting 15 knots from the storm front. Low light, rain obscuring visibility. He turned back to Lin. "You say you don't miss? Uncase. 1 shot. Cold bore. You hit that plate, you get a seat on the bird. You miss and you stay here and file paperwork." It was a setup. A cold bore shot, the first shot fired from a clean, cold barrel, was notoriously unpredictable. Add the rain, the darkness, the gusting wind, and the pressure of the entire team watching, and it was a shot most veteran snipers would refuse to take without a sighter. Lin didn't argue. Arguments were for people who needed to be right. She needed to be lethal. She dropped to the wet tarmac, ignoring the puddle that soaked instantly through her fatigues. Her movements were fluid, practiced. She uncased the Mk-22, the bolt sliding home with a metallic clack that sounded like a heavy door closing. She settled behind the scope. The world narrowed. The rain became a math problem. The wind was a variable. Her heartbeat was a metronome she could pause. Distance, 850. Elevation, 6.2 mils. Wind, full value, left to right. Hold 1.5 mils left. She breathed in, the smell of jet fuel filling her lungs. She exhaled, pushing the air out until her lungs were empty, entering the natural respiratory pause. Her finger curled around the trigger. A steady, increasing pressure. Crack. The suppressed shot was a sharp whip crack, followed by the supersonic snap of the bullet tearing through the air. For a second, there was only the sound of the rain. Then, a distinct, metallic gong echoed back from the darkness. Vegas looked through his spotting scope. Impact. Dead center. Holy sh*t. The men of Echo Team shifted, exchanging glances. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Lin cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. It chimed as it hit the pavement. She stood up, casing her rifle with the same mechanical indifference. She looked at Thorne. His face was a mask of stone. There was no admiration there, no apology, only a cold calculation. "Get your gear on the bird," Thorne said, turning his back on her, "and don't expect a medal for doing your job." "I don't want a medal, sir," Lin whispered to his retreating back. "I just want a clear line of fire." The interior of the MH-60 Black Hawk was a sensory void of vibration and darkness. There was no talking, only the crackle of the inter-squad radio in Sergeant Maya Lin's earpiece and the rhythmic, thumping heartbeat of the rotors overhead. The team sat knee to knee, bathed in the faint red glow of the tactical lights, their faces obscured by ballistic masks and the dual-tube night vision goggles flipped up on their helmets. Lin checked her gear for the third time. Magazine seated, optics covers flip open, dope, data on previous engagement, card taped to the stock of her rifle. She was the smallest figure in the cabin, but her presence felt heavy. A stone dropped into a still pond. The men of Echo Team ignored her, their camaraderie a closed loop of hand signals and shoulder checks that she was not part of. 2 minutes out, the crew chief shouted, holding up 2 fingers. Captain Thorne's voice cut through the comms, cold and distorted. "Listen up. Intel says Sector 4 is a ghost town. We are looking for high-value intel on the scientist's location, nothing more. Rules of engagement are strict. Do not fire unless fired upon. Positive identification is mandatory. If you scratch the paint on a civilian car, JAG will have your badges before breakfast." "Copy." "Solid copy," the team chorused. "Sierra 1, Thorne said, singling her out. "You're taking the northern ridge. 0.5 and 82. It's a 3-click hump from the LZ. You give us eyes on the village center. Do not engage unless the team is in imminent danger. You are a camera today, Lin, not a gun. Clear?" "Clear, sir," Lin replied. The order was tactical suicide. 0.582 was isolated, with no extraction route if she was compromised. Thorne was testing her conditioning, seeing if the liability would complain about the hike or the exposure. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The chopper banked hard, the G-force pressing Lin into the canvas seat. Suddenly, the pilot's voice spiked with urgency. "Wave off! Wave off! We have unmapped power lines at primary. Aborting approach. Shift to secondary LZ," Thorne barked. "Get us on the ground." The aircraft lurched, nose flaring up as speed bled off. The side doors were already open, wind whipping through the cabin at 80 knots. "Go! Go! Go!" Lin threw her rope. The fast roping operation was a controlled fall, a blur of friction and adrenaline. Her boots hit the rocky soil of Eastern Europe with a jarring thud. She unclipped, rolled, and brought her rifle up, scanning her sector. The Black Hawk roared, pulling pitch and vanishing into the night sky, leaving them in sudden, crushing silence. She was alone. The team had dropped 400 meters south. She had to move. Lin flipped her NVGs down. The world turned into a monochrome landscape of green phosphorus. Trees became skeletal fingers. Rocks became jagged shadows. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, placing her feet carefully to avoid snapping twigs. Sound traveled far in this valley. The hike to point 582 was brutal. The terrain was a steep incline of loose shale and freezing mud. Her lungs burned and the 80-pound ruck cut into her shoulders, but she maintained a steady pace. Thorne expected her to call in, breathless, asking for a slowdown. She kept her radio silent. She reached the ridge line 20 minutes ahead of schedule. She low-crawled the last 50 yards, sliding into a depression between two granite boulders that offered a perfect view of the valley floor below. "Sierra 1 in position," she whispered into her mic. "Set." "Copy, Sierra," Thorne replied, sounding almost disappointed. "Alpha element moving to phase line blue." Lin deployed the bipod of her MK-22 and settled into the dirt. She pulled her thermal imager from her pouch, pressing the rubber cup to her eye. The device hummed quietly, translating heat into visual data. The village below was supposed to be abandoned. Intelligence had confirmed it was a cold zone, evacuated weeks ago by the Separatists. Thorne was walking his men down the main road, trusting that intel. Lin scanned the rooftops. Nothing. She scanned the windows. Nothing. She scanned the tree line bordering the extraction route. Her breath hitched. On the thermal display, the cold tree line was glowing. Not with the shapeless heat of animals, but with distinct upright forms. White-hot silhouettes. 1, 2, 5, 10. They were lying prone, their heat signatures blending with the ground, invisible to the naked eye or standard night vision. They were in a classic L-shaped ambush formation, waiting. "Command," Lin said, her voice barely a breath, fighting the urge to scream. "Sierra 1 has contact." "Say again, Sierra." Thorne's voice was impatient. "We have zero movement on the ground. I have multiple heat signatures, North Quadrant, grid 44-9. They are dug in. It's an ambush, sir. You are walking into a kill box. Check your equipment, Sergeant," Thorne snapped. "Drone overflight an hour ago showed nothing. You're seeing deer. Maintain discipline." Lin adjusted the focus. The white-hot shape of a man shifted. He raised a long, tubular object, an RPG. "That is not a deer, Captain," Lin whispered, her finger sliding into the trigger guard. "That is a hunter." Sergeant Lin didn't argue again. Argument was noise, and noise was death. If Thorne wouldn't listen to her words, she had to be ready to speak in the only language that couldn't be ignored. Ballistics. She low-crawled 10 meters to the right, sliding into the skeletal remains of an old shepherd's watchtower that capped the ridge of point 582. It was little more than a pile of jagged limestone and rotted timber, but it offered a singular advantage: elevation. She pulled the scrim of her ghillie hood over her head, breaking up the human outline of her helmet and shoulders. Within seconds, she ceased to be a soldier and became part of the ruin, a patch of moss and shadow in the moonlight. Below, the valley was a bowl of darkness. Through her scope, the green phosphorescent world of her night vision revealed the ghostly procession of Echo Team. They were moving tactically, hugging the walls of the village outskirts, weapons up. They looked professional, they looked lethal, and they looked completely exposed. Lin pulled her Kestrel 5700 weather meter from her chest rig. She held it up for a fraction of a second, shielding the small screen. Wind, 8 UMEC, gusting to 12. Direction, 3 o'clock full value. Temperature, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure, falling. The data was fed into her mind, crunching the firing solution for the thermal signatures she had spotted in the tree line. But as she scanned back to the ambush site, something flickered near the village church, a structure dominating the center square where Thorne was heading. It wasn't the glowing blob of an infantryman. It was a rhythmic distortion, a shimmer in the air that didn't match the surrounding static. Mirage. Heat rising from a barrel. Lin dialed the magnification on her Schmidt and Bender scope to 20x. The image jumped, grainy but distinct. In the belfry of the church, obscured by sandbags and shadow, was the distinct outline of a Dragunov SVD barrel. Behind it, the heat signature of a shooter and a spotter. They weren't just waiting for anyone. They had set up a classic L ambush, and the sniper in the tower was the trigger. "Command Sierra 1, Lin said, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away all emotion to leave only hard facts. "I have a priority 1 target. Enemy sniper team located in the church tower. Grid 44-9, sub-key 2. Distance from your position, 400 meters. There was a pause on the line. Static hissed. "Sierra, we are at the church perimeter." Thorne's voice came back, tight with irritation. "We have 0 movement. The windows are boarded. You are seeing ghosts, Lin. Maintain radio silence unless you have a PID on a weapon that is actively engaging us. You are clogging the net." "Sir, I have positive identification on an SVD Dragunov," Lin insisted, her hand tightening on the grip of her MK-22. "He is tracking you. If you cross the market square, he will have a clear shot." "We have a timeline, Sergeant. We are moving. Out." The click of the radio cutting off felt like a physical blow. Lin watched through her scope, helpless, as the first element of Echo Team broke cover and moved into the open square. It was a tactical error born of arrogance and bad intelligence, but it was happening. Thorne was in the lead. He moved with confidence, his rifle shouldered, scanning the ground. Level. He wasn't looking up. Nobody ever looked up. Lin shifted her aim. She abandoned the ambush team in the trees and swung her rifle toward the church tower. The range was 1,150 meters, a long poke for night operations, especially with the gusting crosswind whipping through the valley. She ranged the target, checked her dope card, dialed 9.4 mils of elevation into her turret. The enemy sniper in the tower adjusted his position. Lin saw the heat bloom of his hand moving to the bolt of his rifle. He wasn't looking at the point man. He was looking at the radio antenna sticking up from the second man in the stack. Thorne. The enemy sniper was hunting the leader. Lin's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were rock steady. The rules of engagement were clear. Do not fire unless fired upon. Do not engage without clearance. If she pulled the trigger now, she would be court-martialed for firing on a target her commander claimed didn't exist. She would end her career in a federal prison, but if she didn't fire, Elias Thorne was a dead man. She watched the enemy sniper settle. His barrel stopped moving. He had his solution. "Don't do it," she whispered to the pixelated shape in her scope. "Don't make me ruin my life." The enemy shooter didn't hear her. His finger tightened. Lin took a breath. She pushed the safety on her MK-22 forward. The red dot appeared. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a liability. She was the only thing standing between the captain and a 7.62mm rimmed cartridge. The enemy sniper's posture stiffened, the pre-shot tension. He was going to take the shot. The trigger broke. It was a crisp glass rod snap that sent a shockwave through the stock of the MK-22 and into the hollow of Maya Lin's shoulder. For a sniper, time is not linear. It is measured in the flight of a bullet. At 150 meters, the 338 Norma Magnum round would take approximately 1.6 seconds to bridge the gap between her position and the church tower. In that suspended eternity, Lin could do nothing but hold her follow-through, keeping the crosshairs on the target even as the recoil pushed her vision skyward. She watched. She waited. 1,000. 2, 1 thou. Through the optic, she saw the muzzle flash from the church tower a microsecond before her own round arrived. The enemy sniper had fired. The impact of Lin's bullet was silent at this distance, but the result was graphic. The thermal signature in the bell tower, the white-hot shape of the shooter's head, simply evaporated. It shattered into a spray of cooling gray pixels, a pink mist rendered in the detached monochrome of the thermal display. The threat was neutralized, but she was too late. "Man down! Man down!" The radio frequency shattered instantly. The screaming wasn't coming from Thorne. It was coming from Sergeant Vegas Moretti. "Miller is hit! Neck wound! Massive hemorrhage!" Lin panned her scope down to the square. The point. Man Miller, the soldier Thorne had claimed was recovering in Kandahar, or perhaps this was his replacement using his call sign, had crumpled to the cobblestones. The enemy sniper had missed Thorne by inches. the bullet finding the man standing adjacent to the antenna. "Contact! Contact front!" Thorne roared, his voice distorted by the gunfire that suddenly erupted from the tree line. The silence of the valley disintegrated. The deer Lin had reported, the heat signatures Thorne had dismissed, opened up with coordinated fury. Streams of green tracer fire arced from the woods, converging on Echo Team's position in the center of the village. It was a deluge of lead, a heavy machine gun hammering the low stone walls where the team scrambled for cover. "Sierra 1, report!" Thorne screamed, the background noise of the firefight nearly drowning him out. "Where is that fire coming from?" "I told you, Captain," Lin yelled back, abandoning the whisper of the hide. "North tree line, sector 44-9. You are in a complex ambush. Get to cover. We're pinned. We can't move." An RPG screeched from the woods, a jagged line of smoke illuminated by the moon. It slammed into the fountain in the center of the square, detonating with a concussive thump that shook the ground even up at Lin's elevation. Dust and debris swallowed the thermal view for a moment. Lin worked the bolt of her rifle. Clack, clack. A fresh round chambered. She couldn't save Miller. She couldn't stop the machine gun fire with a sniper rifle. Not easily, but she could buy them time. "Thorne, get your men into the church," Lin ordered, dropping the honorifics. In the chaos, rank dissolved. There were only those who could see and those who couldn't. "It's the only hard cover. I cleared the tower. The sniper is dead. Go, now." "Negative. We are taking heavy fire from the east." "The east is clear. It's Echo off the canyon walls." Lin gritted her teeth, scanning the tree line. She found the RPG gunner reloading. She checked the wind. It had picked up. "Hold 2 mils right." She fired. The RPG gunner collapsed, his weapon falling uselessly into the brush. "Move, Captain. I am covering you." Down in the kill zone, Thorne hesitated. The tracers were chewing up the brickwork around him. He looked at Miller's body, then at the church doors. He had to trust the voice in his ear, the voice he had tried to silence all week. "Echo Team, pop smoke. Bounding overwatch to the church. Go, go." Thick clouds of white smoke billowed out, obscuring the team from the tree line. Lin didn't need to see them to know where they were. She focused entirely on the enemy muzzle flashes in the woods. She fell into a rhythm, a deadly metronome. Locate, range, fire, cycle. She dropped a machine gunner. She put a round through the engine block of a technical truck trying to flank them. She was surgical, methodical, suppressing an entire platoon-sized element from a mile away. "We're inside," Thorne gasped over, the comms breathless. Miller didn't make it." "Secure the perimeter, Captain," Lin said, her eye never leaving the scope. "This isn't over. That was just the opening act." As if in response to her words, a low rhythmic thumping sound began to echo from the far side of the valley. It wasn't a helicopter. It was the heavy chugging report of a DSHK heavy machine gun. A stream of high-caliber rounds, bullets the size of fingers, began to tear through the walls of the church as if they were made of paper. "Sierra!" Thorne shouted. "They have a heavy! It's tearing the building apart! Do you have eyes on it?" Lin scanned frantically. The sound was coming from a fortified bunker dug into the hillside, shielded by heavy timber and earth. She could see the muzzle flash, a relentless strobe light of death. "I see it," Lin whispered, "but it's behind fortifications. My rounds won't penetrate. If you don't stop that gun, we're all dead in 5 minutes." Lin looked at the bunker. The firing slit was narrow, barely 6 inches high, at 1,400 meters, in the dark. She looked at her scope. The wind was howling now. "Copy," she said, her voice hollow. "Stand by." The sound of a DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun is not a rattle. It is a rhythmic, concussive pounding that can be felt in the teeth and the chest. Down in the valley, the Russian-made weapon was chewing through the limestone walls of the church with terrifying ease. Through her scope, Sergeant Lin watched as fist-sized chunks of masonry exploded from the church facade. Every round that impacted sent a cloud of pulverized rock into the night air. The tracers were a relentless stream of green hate, hammering the one sanctuary Echo Team had left. "Command, we are taking effective fire. We are combat ineffective." Thorne's voice was barely audible over the din of the impacts. Requesting immediate close air support. Grid 44-9. Danger close. Lin shifted her gaze to the heavy gun emplacement. It was dug deep into the hillside, shielded by layers of earth and logs. She could see the muzzle flash, a strobe light in the dark. But the gunner was invisible, protected by a steel shield. Echo Leader, this is Overlord, the radio crackled, the voice from headquarters distant and detached. Negative on KS. Weather is red at the staging base. Birds are grounded. You're on your own. We won't last 10 minutes, Thorne screamed. The line went dead. Lin felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The storm that had hidden their approach was now their death sentence. She worked the bolt of her MK-22. She had to thread a needle. The vision slit on the DSHK shield was perhaps 4 inches high. Range 420 meters. Wind gusting 18 miles. Target moving. She fired. The round sparked harmlessly off the sloped steel of the gun shield. The gunner didn't even flinch. The heavy pounding continued without pause. Sierra, do something, Vegas screamed over the squad. Net. The roof is coming down. Inside the church, the situation was catastrophic. The DSHK rounds had chewed through the main support pillar near the altar. With a groan that rivaled the thunder outside, a section of the vaulted ceiling gave way. Lin watched through the thermal imager as the heat signatures of her team scattered. One signature didn't move fast enough. Captain! Thorne was buried under a pile of rubble near the nave. He wasn't dead. His heat signature was pulsing, bright red indicating surface blood flow. But he was pinned. I'm hit! Thorne gasped, his voice wet. Leg is pinned. Can't feel my foot. Cover the captain, Vegas ordered, dragging another soldier by the vest. Sierra, suppress that gun or we are all going home in bags. Lin gritted her teeth so hard her jaw ached. She fired again. Clack, boom. The round hit the sandbags inches from the slit. She fired again. Clack, boom. A spark on the barrel. It wasn't enough. She was a sniper, not an A-10 Warthog. She couldn't destroy a bunker with a .338 Lapua. She felt a surge of panic, a crack in her icy demeanor. The training manuals didn't cover how to stop a siege weapon with a bolt-action rifle while your commander bled out. Then the rhythm changed. The pounding stopped. For a second, Lin thought she had hit him. She pulled her eye back from the scope, scanning the dark hillside with her naked eye. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the green tracers erupted again. But they weren't aiming at the church. They were arcing upward, toward the ridge, toward point 582. The air around Lin exploded. The supersonic crack of 12.7 million rounds passing inches from her head sounded like tearing canvas. Rock shards sprayed her face, cutting her cheek. The sheer kinetic energy of the rounds impacting the watchtower shook the ground beneath her belly. Sierra! Breaking! Lin rolled hard to her right, abandoning the rifle for a split second as the stone wall she had been using for cover disintegrated under the heavy fire. A round punched through the masonry where her head had been a moment ago. Sierra 1 is compromised, she yelled into her radio, pressing her face into the dirt as the world above her turned into a storm of shrapnel. I am pinned, taking heavy fire. Lin, get out of there, Vegas shouted. I can't move. The enemy gunner had found her. He was walking the fire back and forth across the ridgeline, suppressing her completely. If she lifted her head, she would be decapitated. If she stayed, the crumbling tower would bury her. She was isolated. The team couldn't help her. Air support wasn't coming. And now the heavy gun wasn't just suppressing her, it was keeping her head down so the infantry could move. Through the ringing in her ears, Lin heard a new sound. Not the heavy thump of the gun, but the crunch of boots on shale. Close. She looked at her thermal imager, lying sideways in the dirt. 3 heat signatures were moving up the slope on her flank. They weren't shooting. They were hunting. The heavy rhythmic thumping of the DSHK abruptly ceased. To an untrained ear, the silence might have signaled safety. To Sergeant Maya Lin, it signaled an execution. The gunner hadn't run out of ammo. He had checked fire to allow his infantry to finish the job up close. Lin rolled onto her back, spitting dust. Her ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that masked the subtle crunch of boots on the shale outside. She didn't try to retrieve the Mk-22. In the confined space of the collapsed watchtower base, the long barrel was a liability. She reached for her chest holster and drew her Glock 19. The movement was muscle memory, smooth and desperate. 3 targets, moving fast, no time for traps. She scrambled backward into the shadows of what used to be a stairwell, pressing her back against the cold, jagged stone. She held her breath, listening. A shadow fell across the opening of the ruin. The first soldier entered carelessly, expecting a corpse or a terrified spotter cowering in the dirt. He swept his AK-74 left. Lin exploded from the darkness. Violence of action. It was the only equalizer she had. She stepped inside the arc of his weapon, jamming the muzzle of her pistol into the soft armor of his vest. She fired twice, pop, pop, driving the air from his lungs, then snapped the pistol up and fired once into the ocular cavity. The Mozambique drill. Textbook. The soldier crumpled without a sound, but his body hadn't even hit the floor before the other 2 were shouting. Lin didn't pause. She used the falling body as a momentary shield, shoving it toward the entrance as rounds chewed into the stone around her. She dove to the right, behind a pile of fallen timber. "Granada!" one of them screamed. A grenade. Lin didn't think. She scrambled up the precarious remains of the staircase, her boots slipping on the loose masonry. The explosion below shook the foundation, sending a plume of stinging dust and shrapnel up the shaft. The concussive wave slammed her against the wall, knocking the wind out of her. She wheezed, tasting copper. Her vision blurred. Get up or die." She heard them rushing the stairs. They thought she was stunned. They were right, but she wasn't helpless. Lin holstered her pistol and pulled the combat knife from her belt. As the first head crested the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the moonlight filtering through the broken roof, she struck. It wasn't a duel. It was a slaughter. She drove the blade into the gap between the helmet and the plate carrier. The man gurgled and fell backward, knocking the third man down the stairs with him. Lin drew her pistol again, leaning over the jagged edge of the floor. The last man was scrambling to untangle himself from his comrade's body. He looked up, his eyes wide, realizing too late that the girl was not a victim. She fired once. The slide locked back. Empty. Silence returned to the ridge, heavy and suffocating. Lin sank to her knees, her chest heaving. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. Killing at a mile was geometry. Killing at 3 feet was murder. She looked at the bodies. They were young. It didn't matter. "Sierra, report!" Thorne's voice crackled in her earpiece. He sounded weaker. "Lin, are you gone?" The sound of his voice snapped her back. The DSHK down below had started up again, hammering the church. Every second she spent trembling was a second Thorne bled. Lin reloaded her pistol and crawled back to her rifle. It was covered in dust, but the action was closed. She wiped the lens of the scope with her thumb. The original firing position was burned. The machine gunner knew exactly where that window was. If she showed herself there again, she was dead. She looked up. The watchtower had a jagged, crumbling wall that jutted out over the cliff edge like a broken tooth. It offered zero cover. No sandbags, no shadow. Anyone lying there would be silhouetted against the sky. But it offered an angle, a direct line of sight into the DSHK bunker's side slit. It was a suicide position. "I'm here, Captain," Lin whispered, her voice rasping. "I'm not gone." "Fall back," Thorne wheezed. "Save yourself. That's an order." Lin grabbed the drag bag. She looked at the exposed ledge. "Negative, Command," she said, slinging the rifle over her bruised shoulder. "I'm moving to engage." She stepped out into the wind. The ledge was a nightmare. It was a slab of limestone jutting out over the abyss, slick with rain and vibrating from the concussive force of the battle raging below. There was no cover. To take the shot, Sergeant Maya Lin had to lie prone on the very edge, her silhouette cut sharply against the lighter gray of the storm clouds. If the enemy looked up, they would see her. If the gunner turned his turret 5 degrees to the left, he would vaporize her. Lin deployed the bipod legs of the Mk-22, digging the claws into the wet stone. She settled the stock into the pocket of her shoulder, loading her body weight into the rifle. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She didn't feel the bruise on her cheek or the exhaustion in her muscles. She brought her eye to the scope. From this new angle, the DSHK bunker was exposed, but only just. The gunner was protected by layers of sandbags and steel, but the side aperture, the ventilation slit used to clear the weapon's massive gas pressure, was visible. It was a dark, rectangular gap. 6 inches high, 12 inches wide. Target distance, 1,460 meters. At this range, the bullet would be in the air for nearly 3 seconds. It would drop over 40 feet from the muzzle to the target. "Lin, listen to me," Thorne's voice rasped in her ear, weaker now, slurred by pain and blood loss. "You don't have the angle. You're exposing yourself for nothing. Get to the extract point. That is a direct order." "I have the angle," Lin whispered, her voice flat. "It's a mile away in a storm. You can't make that shot," Thorne shouted, coughing violently. "Don't die for me, Maya. Please." It was the first time he had used her first name. It was a plea, not a command. It was the sound of a man who had accepted his death and didn't want company. Lin reached up and pulled the comms wire from her headset. The world went silent. No more screaming, no more orders, no more doubt. She was alone with the physics. She looked at the Kestrel meter one last time. The wind was the enemy. It was gusting 20 km/h from the left, but down in the valley, the smoke was drifting right. A switching wind, the hardest condition a sniper could face. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, visualizing the bullet's flight path. It wasn't just a straight line. It was a curve in 3 dimensions. Gravity drags it down. Wind pushes it sideways. Drag slows it down. But there was more. At 1,400 meters, the rotation of the Earth mattered. Coriolis effect. The planet would spin beneath the bullet while it was in the air. She had to aim slightly left to account for the Earth moving east. Spin drift. The rifling of the barrel spun the bullet to the right. At this distance, that spin would cause the round to drift 10 inches off center. She opened her eyes. The math settled into a firing solution. Elevation, 16.4 mils. Windage, left, 3.2 mils. Lead, none. Target is stationary. She dialed the turrets. Click, click, click. The crosshairs settled on the black gap in the bunker. It was a pixelated void in her scope. Somewhere inside that darkness was a man pulling a trigger that was killing her team. Lin exhaled. She pushed all the air out of her lungs until her body was empty. A vacuum. Her heart rate slowed. Thump, thump. She waited for the lull in the wind. She watched the grass on the slope. Now, she squeezed. The rifle roared, kicking back violently on the slick rock. The flash suppressor couldn't hide the flame in the dark. She was revealed. "Send it," she whispered. The bullet, a 300-grain jacketed hollow point, screamed across the valley. It punched through the wall of wind, fighting gravity, spinning at thousands of revolutions per second. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Through the scope, Lin didn't see the impact. She saw the reaction. The rhythmic flashing of the DSHK muzzle stopped instantly. There was no spark on the steel shield this time. The bullet had threaded the needle. It had passed through the 6-inch gap and struck the gunner in the chest. The hydrostatic shock in the confined space devastating the crew inside. The heavy thumping that had dominated the battlefield for the last 20 minutes was gone. Lin cycled the bolt. Clack. She held her breath, waiting for the gun to start again, waiting for the second gunner to take over. Silence. She reconnected her comms wire. The static rushed back in, frantic and loud. "Sierra? Sierra 1? Did you fire? The gun is down. Repeat, heavy gun is down," Vegas was screaming. "Target neutralized," Lin said. Her voice didn't shake. "Bunker is clear." "Holy—" A pause. Then Thorne's voice, faint but filled with a profound, stunned disbelief. "Good copy, Sierra. Good copy." Lin didn't celebrate. She shifted her hips, wincing as the sharp rock dug into her ribs. She had saved them. She had made the impossible shot. But the muzzle flash had been a beacon. A tracer round zipped past her ear, cracking like a whip. Then another. Then a storm of them. The infantry in the woods had seen the flash. Every gun in the valley was now turning toward the exposed ledge on .582. Heat on the ledge on point 582 disintegrated. It wasn't a slow crumble. It was a violent erosion driven by hundreds of 7.62mm rounds hammering the limestone. Sergeant Lin scrambled backward, pressing herself into a shallow fissure in the rock face as stone shards sprayed her armor like buckshot. She was pinned. Effectively, she was combat ineffective. "Sierra, status!" Vegas yelled over the comms. "We are moving the captain. We need cover." "I'm taking effective fire from 3 quadrants," Lin shouted back, checking her magazine. 2 rounds left. She dug into her pouches. 1 spare magazine. That was it. 5 rounds of ammunition to hold back a company of infantry. "Viper 2-6 is inbound," a new voice cut in. The pilot of the extraction, Black Hawk. "ETA 2 minutes. We see heavy tracer fire in the LZ. We cannot commit to a hot landing zone. You need to suppress those small arms or we are waving off." "We can't suppress," Vegas screamed. "We are carrying a casualty. We are combat ineffective." Lin closed her eyes for a split second. The math was simple again. The helicopter wouldn't land if the enemy was shooting at the church. The enemy was shooting at the church because they knew the Americans were clustered there. They needed a new target, a better target. Lin looked at the IR strobe attached to her helmet, the buzzsaw. When activated, it pulsed a blinding infrared light visible only to night vision devices and aircraft sensors. It was the "Here I Am" beacon. "Viper 2-6, this is Sierra 1, Lin said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "I am marking the primary threat axis. Shift your approach vector to the south. I will draw the fire." "Sierra, what are you doing?" Thorne's voice was a whisper, delirious but terrified. "Maya, stay down." Lin didn't answer. She jammed her last magazine into the magwell. She reached up and clicked the IR strobe on. Then she did the unthinkable. She stood up. On the dark ridge line, to the naked eye, she was a shadow. But to the enemy forces equipped with night vision, she had just turned into a lighthouse. She was a beacon of pulsing light standing tall against the sky. "Hey!" she screamed at the darkness, her voice raw. "Over here!" She shouldered the MK-22 and fired. Crack. A soldier in the tree line dropped. She cycled the bolt. Crack. Another one. The reaction was instantaneous. The enemy fire shifted. The green streams of tracers that had been pouring into the church square suddenly whipped upward, converging on the lone figure on the ridge. "Contact shifted," the pilot shouted. "LZ is cooling. We are going in. 30 seconds. The air around Lin became a swarm of angry hornets. Bullets snapped past her ears, tugged at her uniform, sparked off the rock at her feet. She didn't flinch. She just kept cycling the bolt, drawing every ounce of hate the enemy had to offer. 1 round left. Below, the roar of the Black Hawk filled the valley. The wash of the rotors kicked up a sandstorm in the square. "Loading! Loading!" Vegas yelled. "Captain is on board. Go! Go!" "Sierra 1, we have the package," the pilot called out. "Move to extraction. We can't hold." "Go!" Lin whispered. A sudden, sledgehammer impact spun her around. It felt like being hit by a truck. The round caught her in the left shoulder, punching through the soft armor near the clavicle. The force threw her backward against the rock wall. The MK-22 flew from her hands, clattering over the edge of the cliff. She slid down the rock face, leaving a smear of dark blood. The world went gray, then white. "Sierra, we are lifting. Get to the zone." Vegas was screaming now. Lin tried to reach for her radio, but her left arm wouldn't move. It was dead weight. She keyed the mic with her right hand, her fingers slippery with blood. "Viper, get them out," she rasped. Winchester, I'm compromised." "No, we are not leaving her." Thorne's voice broke through, stronger now with the adrenaline of panic. "Set it down, set it down." "Sir, we are taking RPG fire. We have to leave now or we all die," the pilot shouted. The miniguns on the Black Hawk opened up. Bert! A sound like canvas tearing, spraying thousands of rounds into the tree line. It was a wall of noise that drowned out everything. From her position in the dust, Lin watched the helicopter lift off. It banked hard, flares popping from its sides to decoy heat-seeking missiles. A beautiful, terrifying angel of fire ascending into the clouds. They were safe. The enemy fire slackened as the bird disappeared. Then the silence returned. Lin lay alone in the ruins of Point 582. Her rifle was gone. Her arm was useless. And down the slope, the crunch of boots on loose shale was getting louder. She reached for her pistol. Consciousness returned in jagged, violent flashes. First, there was the vibration, a bone-rattling hum that seemed to originate from the center of her spine. Then the smell, a sickening cocktail of JP-8 jet fuel, burnt plastic, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Finally, the light, a harsh, red, tactical glow that bathed everything in the color of a developing room. Sergeant Maya Lin gasped, her body arching off the canvas litter. "Easy! I've got you! Hold her down!" A heavy hand pressed onto her chest, pinning her. It wasn't an attack. It was an anchor. Lin blinked, her vision swimming. She was no longer on the ridge. She was inside the belly of a Pave Hawk, the specialized medical variant of the Black Hawk. The ceiling was a maze of wires and medical tubing. "Pressure is dropping, 80 over 40. We're losing volume." A flight medic, a PJ, pararescue man, was working over her left shoulder with frantic precision. He was packing the wound with combat gauze, his movements a blur of practiced violence. The pain was distant, muted by a chemical fog, but the cold was absolute. She felt like she was submerged in ice water. "Thorne," she rasped. The word was a bubble of blood on her lips. "I'm here, Lin. I'm right here." The face hovering above her wasn't the medic. It was Captain Elias Thorne. He was stripped of his gear, his own leg wrapped heavily in bandages, propped up awkwardly against the bulkhead. His face, usually a mask of granite authority, was cracked open. It was pale, streaked with soot and sweat, his eyes wide with a terrifying vulnerability. He was holding her uninjured hand, gripping it so hard his knuckles were white. "You came back," she whispered, the memory of the cliff edge hazy. "The gunships cleared the ridge," Thorne said, his voice struggling to be heard over the scream of the engines. "We didn't leave you. We don't leave our own." Our own. The words hung in the red-lit air. A week ago, he had called her a liability, a political stunt. Now he looked at her as if she were the only thing holding the aircraft together. The PJ injected something into her IV line. "Ketamine pushing. Stay with me, Sergeant. Don't you fade out." Lin's head rolled to the side. Her eyes drifted to the cockpit center console, visible through the gap between the pilot's seats. A small LCD screen was displaying the feed from the overhead drone, the ISR platform that had finally arrived on station to cover their extraction. The screen showed a replay of the thermal footage from the ridge. Thorne followed her gaze. He saw it too. On the small, grainy screen, the thermal recording showed the timeline of the last hour. It showed the massive heat signature of the DSHK bunker. It showed the dozens of smaller heat signatures, enemy infantry, swarming up the hill, and it showed one solitary, small heat signature on the exposed ledge. Thorne watched the replay. He saw the muzzle flashes from Lin's position. 1, 2, 3. He saw the moment she stood up, a tiny glowing figure against a tide of darkness, flaring her IR strobe to draw the fire away from his team. He saw the sheer volume of hate directed at her, the tracers converging like spokes on a wheel. And still, she stood. She fired. She held the line. Thorne turned back to her, and for the first time in his career, he looked ashamed. "You cleared the heavy gun," Thorne murmured, more to himself than to her. "You suppressed the flank. You drew the fire." Lin couldn't nod. The drugs were pulling her under, a warm, heavy tide dragging her into the black. "I just wanted a clear line of fire," she slurred, repeating her words from the tarmac at Fort Bragg. "You had it," Thorne said, his voice thick. "God help them. You had it." The medic tapped Thorne on the shoulder, signaling him to move back. "She's crashing again. I need room." Thorne didn't let go of her hand immediately. He squeezed it once, a promise, before releasing her. "Get us on the ground," Thorne roared at the pilot, the command voice returning, but laced with desperation. "Burn the engines if you have to. 5 minutes out." Lin stared up at the red lights on the ceiling. They blurred into streaks. The pain was gone now, replaced by a floating sensation. She wondered if she had hit the target. She wondered if the wind had changed. Then there was nothing but the vibration of the rotor blades, beating like a giant mechanical heart, carrying them away from the war, but never truly leaving it behind. Gosh, the war ended as it always did, not with a bang, but with paperwork. 3 days after the extraction, Sergeant Maya Lin stood at attention in a briefing room at Ramstein Air Base. Her left arm was immobilized in a black sling, contrasting sharply with her crisp OCP uniform. The room smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and judgment. Across the table sat a lieutenant colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps and a major from Intelligence, G2. On the wall, a projector displayed a frozen thermal image of the village square, the moment just before Lin had taken her first shot. "Sergeant Lin," the lieutenant colonel began, tapping a pen against a thick file folder. "We have reviewed the drone footage and the comms logs. The timeline is problematic." Lin stared at the wall, her expression neutral. "Sir, at Oro 200 hours, you reported a sniper team in the church tower. Captain Thorne disputed this intel. At 0201 hours, you fired one round, neutralizing a target in that tower. The enemy ambush on the ground did not initiate fire until 3 seconds after your shot." The colonel looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Do you understand the implication? You fired the first shot in a volatile sector. You technically initiated the engagement without a direct order, and without the team being under effective fire at that exact moment. Strictly speaking, that is a violation of the rules of engagement." "The target was tracking the captain, sir," Lin said, her voice steady. "He was in the pre-shot sequence. It was an imminent threat." "But he hadn't fired," the major from G2 interjected, "and your commander had explicitly ordered you to hold. If you were wrong, you would have murdered a civilian and sparked an international incident." "But I wasn't wrong, sir." "That's not the point, Sergeant. The point is the chain of command." The door to the briefing room opened. It wasn't a tentative entrance. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a crutch hitting the linoleum. Captain Elias Thorne hobbled into the room. He looked like a wreck, his leg in a cast, his face stitched up where the masonry had cut him. But his uniform was pressed, and his gaze was sharp enough to cut glass. "Room! Attention!" the major barked instinctively, though Thorne was technically the same rank. "As you were," Thorne grunted, waving a hand. He limped to the empty chair beside Lin. He didn't look at her. He looked at the JAG officer. "Colonel, I am reading the draft of your AAR," Thorne said, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation. "It seems to imply that Sierra 1 went rogue." "She fired against orders, Captain. The logs are clear." Thorne leaned forward, wincing as his legs shifted. "The logs are incomplete. My radio was malfunctioning due to the terrain. I gave a visual signal." The room went silent. Lin kept her eyes forward, but her pulse quickened. There had been no visual signal. Thorne was lying to a superior officer. "A visual signal?" the colonel asked, skeptical. "At night? From 400 meters?" "We established a protocol before deployment," Thorne lied smoothly. "If I touched my helmet antenna twice, she was green-lit to engage any imminent threat. I saw the glint in the tower. I signaled. She took the shot. The delay in the enemy returning fire was simply their shock at losing their initiator." Thorne paused, letting the weight of his combat experience crush the bureaucratic skepticism in the room. "Sergeant Lin did not violate ROE. She executed a synchronized sniper initiation under my direct command. If you want to court-martial someone for starting the fight, you can put my name on the charge sheet." The lieutenant colonel looked at Thorne, then at Lin. He knew it was a fabrication. He knew it was the old boys club closing ranks. Except this time, they were closing ranks around a woman they had tried to reject. He sighed, closing the folder. "If the commander confirms the order, then the inquiry is closed. We'll mark it as a justifiable engagement." "Thank you, sir," Thorne said. "Dismissed." Lin and Thorne walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a stark contrast to the darkness of the valley. The hospital wing was quiet, the frantic energy of the battlefield replaced by the slow shuffle of recovering soldiers. They reached the elevator. Thorne pressed the button. They stood in silence for a long moment. There was no hug, no tearful confession, no applause. "You didn't have to do that, sir," Lin said, looking straight ahead. "I can handle the heat. Thorne shifted on his crutches. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Not as a demographic, not as a quota, but as a weapon. I didn't do it for you, Lin, Thorne grunted. I need my best shooter back on the line in 6 weeks. I can't have you sitting in a brig. It was the highest compliment he was capable of giving. He was acknowledging that the team was incomplete without her. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. The doors slid open. Get your arm healed, Sergeant, Thorne said, hobbling inside. We have training scheduled for next month. And Lin? Sir? Thorne pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, he met her eyes. Nice shot. The doors shut. Sergeant Maya Lin stood alone in the empty hallway. She didn't smile. She simply adjusted her sling, turned on her heel, and walked toward the armory. The rifle needed cleaning. The logbook needed updating. The mission was done. The next one was waiting.